From 1861, Thomas Prentice and Co. erected 3 factories, a chemical works, paper mill, and finally a gun cotton factory in 1863. On 21st of February 1870, a grant of license was awarded to the Patent Safety Guncotton Company Limited for the preparation and storing of gun cotton. Gun cotton is nitrocellulose. It's made by steeping clean cotton with 1 part nitric acid to 3 parts sulfuric acid. This cotton had to be washed to remove the excess acid and dried. If not washed properly, the unwashed gun cotton could spontaneously ignite and explode at room temperature, especially if confined. The main use for gun cotton was as a replacement for gunpowder in firearms, including torpedoes. It was also used in blasting as part of the mining process. The gun cotton factory at Stowmarket produced gun cotton for both the government, mining purposes, and a small amount commercially. It was first developed by Christian Friedrich Schönbein, a German-Swiss chemist, in 1846. He accidentally spilt a mixture of nitric acid and sulfuric acid on his kitchen table. He reached for his cotton apron to clean it up and hung it to dry on the stove door. As soon as it dried, it ignited spontaneously. British chemist Professor Abel developed a more refined but lengthy process to make gun cotton safe to manufacture. This included the washing and drying times of the gun cotton being extended to 48 hours and repeated 8 times. He also reduced the acidity to 1 part nitric acid to 2 parts sulfuric acid. He patented his process, and it was this process that the Stowmarket Patent Gun Cotton Company Limited used. Mr. Saunders Trotman, the manager of the works, described at the coroner's inquest the procedure. The cotton was first cleaned with water from the River Gipping and sent to be dipped in the 3 dipping houses. After it had been cooled for 24 hours, the cotton was centrifuged, spun rapidly, to expel the waste acid. It was then tubbed or washed again centrifuged and laid in tanks of water to soak. When wanted, it was then carried to be beaten or broken into pulp. Having been so beaten, it was let down into the poachers for washing. After being washed by the poachers, samples were sent to the local chemist, Mr. Slater, to test that it met government standards. If it failed, it was sent back to be re-washed and then retested. If passed, it was sent to the hydraulic press to be pressed into 8-ounce discs before being packed and stored in the magazines. The tests which were carried out on the samples from the poachers were A. The solubility test, which determined the strength of the samples. 20 grains from the samples were left at room temperature for an hour. They were placed in a test tube with a mixture of sulfuric ether. This was dried, pressed, and shaken several times before being placed in a water bath. This evaporated the last of the ether in the cotton. Once left to be dried, it was weighed. The loss showed the amount of soluble gun cotton present. The larger the loss, the weaker the gun cotton. B. The heat test. This decided if the poachers had washed the cotton perfectly. It had 3 distinct processes: the fuming point, ignition point, and colour test. 9 samples came up daily. The samples came up wet. Sample was placed on top of an oven to dry. Once dry, it was cooled at room temperature for an hour. The sample was placed in clean test tubes and fixed into an oil bath, heated by gas to a temperature of 310 degrees. The tubes were taken out and looked at. The moment it started to show a slight yellow vapour, its temperature was recorded. This was known as its fuming point. If it was below 325, the sample was condemned and ordered to be re-washed. If above 325, the sample was placed back in the bath with a little card laid on top of the tub. It continued to be heated. At about 340 degrees, an explosion was expected. The exact temperature was recorded. Although the government set the exploding temperature at 343, Mr. Eustace set the temperature at 350 for extra safety. If it exploded below 350, it was condemned. C. A colour test. This was considered the most important. A small sample of gun cotton was put into a test tube, once again fixed in an oil bath, with a small piece of iodized test paper suspended above it. This test paper was carefully wetted with distilled water so the upper part of it was wet and the bottom half was dry. The test tube was heated, and around 190 degrees a faint brown line of colour should appear where the wet and dry met. If the colour appeared below 190, the sample was condemned. There were several conditions to the licence of 1871. This included authorisation of those within the dry department, manufacturing processes, position and protection of buildings, and the amount of gun cotton to be stored. The inquest found that 3 of the conditions were not complied with. These were to potentially influence what happened on the 11th of August 1871. Condition 1, which was a regular inspection of persons entering the dry department to make sure they were duly authorised, dressed and inspected. This meant that those working in there were wearing the thick woolen clothing meant to protect them when working with acid. Mr. Trotman said he had chided the men for not wearing the clothing. The factory did not appear to have been inspected by government officials either. Condition 4 was no more gun cotton is allowed to be in the packing house at any one time than is necessary for the completion of a single package. Mr. Trotman admitted that shortly before the explosion, the packing sheds contained about 4 tons of gun cotton. This was on top of the legal limit of 15 tons in total to be stored in the 3 magazines, meaning there was an excess of 21 tons of gun cotton on the site at the time of the explosion. This was the equivalent of 84 tons of gunpowder. Condition 7 was that the magazines were to be protected from each other by sufficient mounds. The inquest found that the mounds had been replaced by brick walls. There was much discussion on whether walls constituted sufficient mounds in the licence. As Captain Magendie, who was sent by the Home Secretary to investigate, stated in his report, sufficient for what? To protect the magazines from communicated explosion or from communicated conflagration. The licence never considered that an explosion could be possible and that both brick walls and mounds would be useless to prevent communicated explosions. We will cover the day of the explosion in the next film.